21. Most handsome black R&B legends and their sons at the same age. Handsome didn't just belong to the spotlight. It was inherited, carried, and sometimes quietly withheld. You think you know the legends of R&B, the faces that once ruled radio vinyl covers and late-night memories? But what happens when time stops? And their sons appear at the same age, same bone structure, same eyes, different choices. This isn't nostalgia, it's confrontation. Today we're opening a chapter few dare to examine legacy without performance, beauty without applause. Stay with legends of black excellence like the video and tell us, does greatness have to be loud to be real? Ray Charles Robinson Jr. Ray Charles was more than a musical icon. He was a cultural force who reshaped American sound in the mid-20th century. Blind by the age of 7, he rose during the 1950s and early 1960s by merging gospel, blues, jazz, and rhythm and blues into a bold new language. By his early 30s, Ray Charles had already released era-defining works like What Did I Say and Georgia on My Mind, won multiple Grammy Awards, and secured creative control at a time when very few black artists were granted such power. His authority came not from spectacle, but from conviction phrasing and emotional precision. Ray Charles Robinson Jr., born in 1958, reached adulthood under the weight of that towering legacy. At roughly the same age his father once ruled the charts, Ray Jr. appeared publicly not as a performer, but as a guardian of truth. He chose writing and producing over the stage, most notably authoring You Don't Know Me, Reflections of My Father, Ray Charles, a memoir grounded in documented history rather than mythology. Should legacy be measured by applause or by honesty? Physically, observers noted familiar traits in Ray Jr. The facial structure, the composed demeanor, but his influence worked differently. He clarified, contextualized, and preserved. Where Ray Charles changed music forever, Ray Charles Robinson Jr. ensured that the man behind the legend would be remembered accurately, responsibly, and with dignity. Sam Cooke Jr. Sam Cooke stood at the crossroads of elegance, courage, and change in American music. Emerging in the late 1950s, he became one of the first black artists to combine a smooth, romantic vocal style with sharp business independence. By his early 30s, Cooke had crossed from gospel to pop, founded his own publishing company, and recorded enduring songs such as You Send Me and A Change Is Gonna Come. His beauty was not only physical, it was disciplined poise and a calm confidence that redefined black masculinity during a tense civil rights era. Sam Cooke Jr. was born after his father's tragic death in 1964, growing up with history rather than guidance. When he reached the same age his father once dominated radio, he chose a quieter direction, working behind the scenes in entertainment and event coordination. Public appearances have been rare, but observers often note familiar facial lines, gentle eyes, and a reserved presence. What distinguishes Sam Cooke Jr. is restraint. He never claimed musical inheritance, never chased comparisons, and never attempted revival through imitation. Instead, he protected memory through discretion and respect. His legacy lives through integrity, memory, and strength. James Brown II. James Brown was not simply famous. He was forceful. Rising from the Deep South in the 1950s, he transformed rhythm and blues into something sharper, louder, and more physical. By his late 20s and early 30s, James Brown had already earned the title the hardest working man in show business, releasing explosive records, commanding stages with military discipline, and reshaping performance culture through movement, precision, and authority. His masculinity was intense, raw, and unapologetic, reflecting both ambition and survival in segregated America. James Brown II, the youngest son of the icon, grew up surrounded by that myth, but chose not to recreate it. When he reached roughly the same age his father once ruled stages worldwide, he appeared publicly only on select occasions tied to cultural remembrance and family legacy. Tall, composed, and strikingly similar in gaze, James Brown II carried a quieter power. He did not dance, shout, or dominate rooms. Instead, he stood with confidence rooted in identity rather than performance. Is presence still powerful when the music stops? What separates James Brown II from expectation is refusal. He refused imitation spectacle and noise. His masculinity expresses control rather than explosion. Where his father burned with urgency, his son radiates steadiness. Together, they reveal how legacy evolves across generations, from fire to focus, from command to composure. Joe Tex Skent. Joe Tex was the voice of wit, warmth, and everyday truth in classic soul music. Rising in the early 1960s, he carved a lane separate from polished Motown by speaking directly to working-class emotions, humor, heartbreak, and resilience. By his early 30s, Joe Tex had released hits like Hold What You've Got and Skinny Legs, and all combining conversational delivery with deep, Southern rhythm. His appeal was never flashy. It lived in swagger, honesty, and the feeling that he was talking to you, not performing for you. Joe Tex grew up observing that legacy without stepping into its spotlight. When he reached the same age his father once stood at soul music's peak, he chose a low-profile life, appearing only occasionally at heritage events and family commemorations. Those moments revealed a striking resemblance: angular features, measured posture, and a calm gaze that felt reflective rather than performative. What defines Joe Tex II is subtlety. He does not recreate songs, adopt stage habits, or lean on nostalgia. Instead, he carries the spirit of his father through restraint and authenticity. Where Joe Tex narrated life's ups and downs through music, his son represents continuity. Jackie Wilson Jr. Jackie Wilson was called Mr. Excitement for a reason. Emerging in the late 1950s, he brought athletic movement, vocal precision, and emotional drama into rhythm and blues. By his early 30s, Wilson had already delivered chart-defining recordings like Lonely Teardrops, toured relentlessly, and influenced generations of performers with his spinning kicks, controlled falsetto, and magnetic stage control. His handsomeness was inseparable from motion. He dazzled audiences by turning discipline into spectacle. Jackie Wilson Jr. reached adulthood carrying that legacy without trying to recreate it. When he appeared publicly at roughly the same age his father once electrified theaters, he did so as a representative, not a performer. Tall, composed, and strikingly familiar in expression, Jackie Jr. drew attention through stillness. He spoke calmly at commemorative events, choosing careful words over performance. Do we notice beauty more when it moves or when it stands still? What defines Jackie Wilson Jr. is quiet authority. He preserved his father's memory through stewardship rather than imitation. Where Jackie Wilson commanded stages with explosive energy, his son commands respect through restraint. Together, they show how charisma evolves across generations, from motion to meaning, from spectacle to reflection, without losing its emotional power for modern audiences today worldwide. Eddie Kendricks Jr. Eddie Kendricks was the unmistakable falsetto of the Temptations, a voice that helped define the elegance and emotional sensitivity of Motown in the 1960s. Rising from Birmingham, Alabama, he reached national prominence in his 20s, and by his early 30s had already recorded classics like My Girl and Just My Imagination. Kendricks projected a refined masculinity, stylish, romantic, and quietly confident, at a time when black male artists were reshaping public perception through grace rather than force. Eddie Kendricks Jr. grew up surrounded by that legacy, but chose a life largely outside the spotlight. When he reached the same age his father once stood at the height of fame, he appeared only occasionally at Motown-related tributes and family events. Those moments left strong impressions. Observers noted the familiar facial structure, the introspective eyes, and a calm demeanor that felt heavy with memory rather than ambition. What sets Eddie Kendricks Jr. apart is emotional presence. He does not sing, publicly tour, or recreate the Temptations' sound. Instead, he embodies reflection. Where his father expressed longing and tenderness through music, his son conveys it through silence and posture. Together, they represent two forms of soul, one voiced through harmony, the other carried quietly through time, dignity, and remembrance. Marvin Gaye. Marvin Gaye III. Marvin Gaye was the sound of intimacy and conscience in American music. Rising through Motown in the early 1960s, he evolved from romantic balladeer into a cultural voice of reflection and protest. By his early 30s, Gaye had already recorded defining works such as What's Going On, reshaping soul music by fusing beauty with social awareness. His presence was gentle but penetrating, marked by a soft gaze-controlled movements, and a voice that invited listeners inward rather than outward. Marvin Gaye III. His adopted son reached adulthood carrying that complex legacy of brilliance and pain. When he arrived at roughly the same age, his father once stood at the height of artistic power, he chose a far more private existence. Though he briefly explored music, his public appearances have been limited and measured. Observers often note familiar features: curly hair, thoughtful eyes, a reserved smile, but without theatrical display. What defines Marvin Gaye III is emotional restraint. He does not attempt to replace or replicate his father's impact. Instead, he carries memory through composure and distance. Where Marvin Gaye sang vulnerability into the world, his son lives it quietly. Together they illustrate how legacy can endure without repetition, and how some forms of beauty are strongest when they are protected, not amplified, allowing remembrance to remain sincere and human across generations. Percy Sledge Jr. Percy Sledge became one of soul music's most recognizable voices in the mid-1960s. In 1966, at just 25 years old, he recorded When a Man Loves a Woman, a record that reached #1 on both the Billboard Hot 100 and R&B charts. By his early 30s, Sledge was internationally known for a style rooted in emotional honesty, restraint, and working-class sincerity. His appeal was never theatrical. It felt personal, grounded, and vulnerable, reflecting a masculinity built on devotion rather than dominance. Percy Sledge Jr. reached adulthood carrying that history without seeking to recreate it. When he arrived at roughly the same age his father once stood at the height of public recognition, he chose a quieter life centered on family, local community, and small-scale music involvement in Alabama. Public appearances have been limited to memorials and heritage events, where observers note a familiar steadiness, calm posture, and attentive gaze. What distinguishes Percy Sledge Jr. is humility. He does not sing, publicly chase recognition, or invite comparison. Instead, he preserves memory through respect and consistency. Where Percy Sledge transformed private emotion into universal song, his son demonstrates how legacy can continue through presence and integrity. Smokey Robinson Jr. Smokey Robinson was the poet of Motown, a man whose voice and pen defined romance in American soul music. Rising in the late 1950s with The Miracles, he became one of the most influential figures in the Motown system, writing and performing classics such as Shop Around the Tracks of My Tears and Ooh Baby Baby. By his early 30s, Smokey Robinson was not only a chart-topping singer, but also a vice president at Motown Records, shaping the sound image and emotional language of an era. His beauty lay in softness, vulnerability, and elegance. Smokey Robinson Jr. grew up surrounded by that cultural weight, but never sought to stand at its center. When he reached roughly the same age his father once dominated radio and television, he chose a life largely outside public performance. Appearing occasionally at charity events and legacy-related gatherings, Smokey Jr. drew attention for subtler reasons: familiar facial features, gentle eyes, and a calm, approachable presence that echoed his father's emotional tone without imitation. Does gentleness still define strength today? What separates Smokey Robinson Jr. from expectation is restraint. He does not sing for crowds or revive the spotlight. Instead, he carries forward an emotional inheritance, warmth, respect, and quiet dignity. Where Smokey Robinson transformed tenderness into timeless music, his son reflects that same tenderness through composure and discretion. Together, they show how legacy can endure not only through sound, but through character memory and the ability to make others feel understood without saying a word. Wilson Pickett Jr. Wilson Pickett embodied raw power in soul music. Emerging from the Southern Circuit in the early 1960s, he became known for a voice that sounded urgent, gritty, and untamed. By his early 30s, Pickett had already delivered defining records such as In the Midnight Hour and Mustang Sally, helping shape the harder edge of soul and early funk. His masculinity was physical and direct, driven by intensity rather than polish, reflecting a generation that demanded to be heard. Wilson Pickett Jr. reached adulthood carrying that unmistakable image without trying to duplicate it. When he arrived at roughly the same age his father once dominated radio playlists, he chose a reserved public life. He has appeared primarily at memorial events and heritage gatherings connected to his father's legacy. In those moments, observers note a familiar sharp gaze, strong facial structure, and a composed stillness that contrasts sharply with his father's explosive stage presence. What defines Wilson Pickett Jr. is control. He does not sing, shout, or revive the sound that made his father famous. Instead, he represents a calmer continuation of identity. Where Wilson Pickett expressed rebellion and urgency through music, his son conveys steadiness and reflection through presence. Together, they illustrate how legacy can shift across generations from force to focus, while still carrying the same emotional weight and unmistakable sense of authenticity that made the name endure. Otis Redding III. Otis Redding was the embodiment of emotional gravity in soul music. Rising rapidly in the early 1960s, he built his reputation on sincerity rather than polished, delivering performances that felt raw, pleading, and deeply human. By his mid-20s, Redding had already recorded enduring works like These Arms of Mine and Try a Little Tenderness, and by 26, he had completed Sittin' on the Dock of the Bay, released shortly after his death in 1967. His presence was powerful without excess, broad-shouldered, grounded, and emotionally direct. Otis Redding III reached adulthood carrying that unfinished legacy. When he arrived at roughly the same age his father once stood at the height of creative impact, he chose continuity without imitation. Working as an artist and cultural advocate, Otis III has appeared primarily in educational settings, memorial events, and community-focused programs tied to his father's history. Observers often note the familiar, calm eyes, steady posture, and an attentive manner that feels reassuring rather than performative. Can quiet strength leave a deeper mark than dramatic display? What defines Otis Redding III is balance. He does not attempt to recreate his father's sound or stage presence. Instead, he protects meaning. Where Otis Redding poured vulnerability into music, his son channels it into stewardship and reflection. Together, they show how legacy can move forward with dignity. One generation speaking through song, the next through presence, responsibility, and care for cultural memory. David Ruffin Jr. David Ruffin was the unforgettable voice and face of the Temptations during their most electrifying years. Rising to prominence in the mid-1960s, he brought a raw edge and emotional intensity that transformed polished Motown soul into something darker and more visceral. By his early 30s, Ruffin had already recorded classics like My Girl and Ain't Too Proud to Beg, becoming known for his sharp cheekbones, penetrating stare, and dramatic delivery. His masculinity was restless, seductive, and conflicted, mirroring both brilliance and personal struggle. David Ruffin Jr. reached adulthood carrying that complex legacy. When he arrived at roughly the same age his father once commanded global attention, he chose a far more measured path. While he has worked intermittently in music and production, his public appearances have remained limited. Those moments reveal familiar features: a lean frame, intense eyes, and a controlled presence that recalls his father's magnetism without the chaos. What distinguishes David Ruffin Jr. is restraint. He does not reenact the turmoil that defined much of his father's life, nor does he rely on nostalgia to define himself. Where David Ruffin expressed longing and tension through explosive performance, his son embodies reflection and control. Together, they illustrate how legacy can evolve, retaining emotional depth while shedding the excess that once consumed its source. Curtis Mayfield Jr. Curtis Mayfield was the conscience of soul music, a writer and performer who fused elegance with moral clarity. Rising in the early 1960s with The Impressions, he became known for socially conscious songs such as People Get Ready and Keep On Pushing. By his early 30s, Mayfield had already established himself as a rare figure in popular music, an artist whose work combined beauty, political awareness, and spiritual calm. His physical presence was understated, but his intelligence and composure gave him lasting authority. Curtis Mayfield Jr. reached adulthood carrying a legacy defined more by meaning than spectacle. When he arrived at roughly the same age, his father once shaped the direction of soul music. He chose a life behind the scenes. Working primarily in production, documentary, sound, and community-based creative projects, Mayfield Jr. avoided public performance. In the few spaces where he appears, observers note a slim frame, quiet confidence, and attentive eyes that suggest reflection rather than ambition. Does influence need a spotlight to be real? What defines Curtis Mayfield Jr. is intention. He does not revive his father's catalog or borrow his image. Instead, he preserves values, thoughtfulness, discipline, and social awareness. Where Curtis Mayfield spoke truth through melody and message, his son carries that same seriousness through restraint and purpose. Together, they show that legacy can endure not only through songs that challenge the world, but through lives that continue to listen, question, and act with quiet conviction. Bobby Womack Jr. Bobby Womack was soul music's master of contradiction, tender yet reckless, spiritual yet streetwise. Rising in the early 1960s, he wrote and performed with an honesty that exposed flaws rather than hiding them. By his early 30s, Womack had already shaped classics like It's All Over Now and Across 110th Street, earning a reputation for raw confession and emotional risk. His presence carried lived experience. The beauty was imperfect, restless, and deeply human. Bobby Womack Jr. reached adulthood aware of both the brilliance and the turbulence that defined his father's story. When he arrived at roughly the same age, his father once commanded stages and studios. He chose a quieter, grounded life. His public appearances have been limited, often tied to small venues or family-related events rather than major spotlights. Observers note a familiar intensity in the eyes, a relaxed posture, and a demeanor that suggests reflection instead of exhibition. What distinguishes Bobby Womack Jr. is acceptance. He does not glamorize struggle or reenact excess. Instead, he carries forward the emotional truth without the self-destruction. Where Bobby Womack turned pain into song, his son transforms awareness into balance. Together, they illustrate an evolution of legacy, from confession to comprehension, showing that depth can remain powerful even when the noise fades and the lessons finally settle. Donny Hathaway Jr. Donny Hathaway remains one of the most emotionally resonant voices in soul music history. Emerging in the late 1960s and early 1970s, he combined classical training, gospel roots, and deep vulnerability into recordings that still feel painfully intimate. By his early 30s, Hathaway had already delivered timeless works such as A Song for You and Someday We'll All Be Free. Songs that carried hope, fragility, and inner struggle with rare honesty. His presence was quiet but intense, marked by a gaze that seemed to carry both brilliance and burden. Donny Hathaway Jr. reached adulthood under the weight of that unfinished story. When he arrived at roughly the same age his father once stood at the height of creative depth, he chose a path away from constant visibility. His involvement in music has centered on theater work, memorial performances, and selective appearances connected to his father's legacy, rather than mainstream recording. Those moments reveal a familiar seriousness, thoughtful eyes, measured movement, and an emotional reserve that feels protective rather than distant. Can depth survive when silence replaces sound? What defines Donny Hathaway Jr. is emotional control. He does not reenact tragedy or attempt vocal comparison. Instead, he honors complexity. Where Donny Hathaway poured his inner life into music, his son carries that sensitivity with care and restraint. Together, they represent two expressions of the same truth, one sung openly, the other guarded quietly, both shaped by feeling dignity and the lasting power of soul. Teddy Pendergrass. Teddy Pendergrass II. Teddy Pendergrass was the embodiment of strength and vulnerability fused into one commanding presence. Rising in the 1970s, first with Harold Melvin and the Blue Notes, and later as a solo star, he became known for a deep, resonant baritone that defined masculine romance in R&B. By his early 30s, Pendergrass had already sold millions of records-filled arenas and reshaped how desire, confidence, and emotional honesty could coexist in black male artistry. Even after the life-altering 1982 car accident, his resilience became part of his legend. Teddy Pendergrass II reached adulthood under that powerful shadow. When he arrived at roughly the same age his father once stood at the height of fame, he chose a different form of influence. Rather than pursuing a recording career, Teddy II became a motivational speaker, wellness advocate, and coach, focusing on healing, perseverance, and personal growth. Public appearances often highlight his calm authority, upright posture, and a voice that carries reassurance rather than performance. What defines Teddy Pendergrass II is steadiness. He does not imitate his father's vocal style or stage presence. Instead, he channels the same inner strength into guidance and service. Where Teddy Pendergrass Sr. moved hearts through song, his son moves people through words, presence, and lived example. Together they show how legacy can transform from performance into purpose, proving that true power does not disappear when the spotlight fades, but finds new ways to uplift others across generations. Keith Washington Jr. Keith Washington emerged in the late 1980s and early 1990s as one of R&B's most polished romantic voices. With a smooth tenor and refined image, he became known for hits like Kissing You and Candlelight, and You projecting elegance and emotional clarity rather than bravado. By his early 30s, Washington had established a reputation built on restraint, consistency, and visual sophistication, appealing to audiences who valued subtlety over excess. Keith Washington Jr. reached adulthood carrying that refined image without attempting to replicate it on stage. When he arrived at roughly the same age his father once stood at his commercial peak, he chose a career outside music, working in fashion, visual branding, and commercial photography. In professional settings, he drew attention through presence rather than performance. Colleagues often note a tall, balanced frame, composed movements, and an instinctive sense of style that echoes his father's aesthetic, without imitation. Does elegance still matter in defining masculinity today? What distinguishes Keith Washington Jr. is distance from expectation. He does not sing, tour, or revisit classic R&B narratives. Instead, he carries forward taste, discipline, and self-awareness. Where Keith Washington expressed romance through melody, his son reflects it through visual language and demeanor. Together, they demonstrate how legacy can evolve from sound to image, showing that beauty and influence can remain powerful even when expressed quietly, deliberately, and on one's own terms. As we look back at these fathers and sons, one truth becomes clear. Legacy is not a mirror, it's a conversation across time. The legends built their names through sound struggle and visibility, while many of their sons chose restraint privacy and quieter forms of influence. Both paths carry weight. Both shape how Black excellence is remembered. But here's the question that matters for us today. Do we honor legacy only when it performs for us, or can we value it when it chooses silence instead of spotlight? At Legends of Black Excellence, the debate is yours because history lives on through how we choose to see it.